It's my pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague from Oxford University Said Business School, Jonathan Reynolds. If anybody knows anything about retailing as unusual, it's Jonathan. He had the kindness of hosting me on a sabbatical in Oxford a couple of years ago. I will forever be grateful for that opportunity. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ulf, and hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. And when Ulf mentioned that you'd been given an assignment about retailing as unusual, I thought, my goodness, and you want me to speak about a few of these things, what shall I speak about? In fact, there's a lot to speak about, because I think in the last couple of years, retailing has gone through a real transformation of opportunities, meaning that there are really a lot of choices that companies have looking ahead. And so what I put together for this session is really three things. Firstly, just some reactions to the lessons that have emerged for retailers from the pandemic the last 2 years. You'll be aware of many of these, and I'm sure you've discussed many of them in your classes. But I wanted just to draw a few conclusions from that, because what's very clear is that some of these lessons are sticking and some are being forgotten by some retailers who are going back to business as usual. And I think that's a dangerous kind of move by those organisations. So let's kind of review together 3 or 4 of the lessons that emerged from the pandemic, and I'll use a framework to do that. But I also want to talk about the longer term challenges. So I've identified 4 broad sets of challenges that I think, thinking of the things you might come up with for your assignments, your projects, ought to cover many of the things that you may well be discussing in your groups. And finally, I want to think about, well, what should retailers plan to do given these longer term challenges and given the lessons that have been learnt? And I want to pick on just a few themes and a couple of examples of firms that have really done some powerfully integrative and progressive strategizing over the last couple of years and have emerged very strong as a result of that. But perhaps I should start with just a bit about me. As Ulf said, I'm based at Oxford University, at the Said Business School. I'm actually a fake business school person. I'm a geographer by background, so it means I have to have maps in all my presentations. So you'll see some maps as we go through here. But you can't be a geographer in a business school, so I'm part of the marketing faculty, and I teach marketing to our MBA students, our undergraduate students. But I also work with companies, a bit like Ulf and colleagues here, working with the leading UK retail companies and others in Europe and elsewhere, some of the leading trade associations, European Commission, Eurocommerce, those kinds of businesses. But my background originally was working with Tesco and with Coca-Cola. So I have a kind of bit of a food supply and grocery background, but I've turned my hand now to everything from pet stores to department stores. So I think I'm reasonably okay on that. So let's focus on this first issue, enough about me. Pandemic lessons for retailing. And one of the biggest challenges I think we all face when we're in the middle of something like a global health crisis, or indeed a geopolitical crisis like Ukraine and Russia, is to see what's going on, to actually understand what's going on when you're in the middle of something. It's only with hindsight sometimes that we can see things for the way they really are, and that's part of human nature. I think that sometimes we are stuck in the moment, and we think, quite rightly, because we happen to be alive at this particular time, that this is the most important transformational moment in history. And I think that's something we have to recognise, that we need to be have a little more humility about some of these kinds of changes, and perhaps look back at equally momentous periods of time when economies and societies face similar kinds of challenges, and understand how they dealt with those challenges. And the first of these, I suppose, is the health crisis itself. And if you look back to what was then called Spanish flu, in fact it was US flu, but the US media decided that was not very fair on Americans, so they called it Spanish flu instead. It was actually developed out of, I think it first was found in an army base in Kansas in 1917. But the Spanish flu in 1918 killed around about 50 million people worldwide. And 500 million, half a billion people actually became infected with the virus. And we've all got very familiar with these kinds of charts in looking at the ebbs and flows of variants and so on. But I'm showing you this not because it's interesting from a health point of view, but it's also interesting, I think, from a retailing point of view, because when the flu outbreak hit in the US, there were many messages. And here was one of them that struck me in the local press at the time: stay at home, shop by phone. Uncle Sam joins us in fight against influenza, authorises lifting of the ban on store deliveries. So that meant that retailers could deliver to homes. Big shops may close next Friday and Saturday. So there was a lockdown. And the internet wasn't available, so shopping by phone was the mechanism that people used. So what goes around comes around. We use whatever technologies we have available to us at the time to avoid some of the crises that we are facing. So it's important, I think, to recognise that we can often see some of the solutions available to us by looking a little further backwards than we would normally be used to doing. Having said that, I agree with Ulf that really we were living through some of the most profound transformational crises for the retail sector that we have seen. And one of the mechanisms and frameworks we often use to think about this is VUCA. I don't know whether you're familiar with this or have done this in class, but it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And it was developed as a concept by the US Army War College in the 1980s to try and contextualize, to try and provide some kind of framework to understand the world after the Cold War. Because it was no longer so certain, no longer so simple, no longer so unambiguous that there were two superpowers at each other's throats and so on. The world had become a much more difficult and complex and to use the English word, wicked place to deal with. And so this term VUCA has been co-opted by management gurus around the world to describe the if you like, the perma crisis or the poly crisis that we're facing today. And we can use this framework to perhaps look at the adaptability and growth prospects of retailers as a result of the pandemic. And what's clear, of course, is, as ever with these things, some companies are better than others at reacting to changing circumstances in a more agile way. And so we have winners, losers, and learners in this mix, including those who have taken the chance to actually change their business strategies. So what we're going to do is just run through these four in a little bit more detail and give you some examples of some of the challenges that companies faced and how they dealt with those challenges. First, this is volatility. And anybody queue up for toilet rolls or pasta during lockdown? Yeah, I think stockpiling was absolutely a characteristic of volatility. If you're used in retail business to forecast sales levels, using seasonal data, using temperature data, using all the kinds of behavioural information that would normally lead to very stable and predictable levels of demand, the fact that people were leaving your store with 3 trolleys full of toilet rolls rather threw out your inventory planning. And you've got this kind of situation here with out of stocks and so on. And why? Why were people doing that? Anyone care to comment on why people were stockpiling? Yeah.
They were worried that supply chains would not be able to keep on going over an extended period of time.
Yeah, they're worried about scarcity, they're worried about running out. But why were they worried about running out of toilet roll? Well, apparently there is this issue around personal hygiene. One of the things we fear most losing control over is personal hygiene, apparently. So the psychologists tell us. And therefore, toilet rolls are one of the things you had to have in the house or in the apartment just in case, stocks ran out. And of course, you then also had what's called social proof, which is the kind of herding behavior that you get when you see one person doing something, so that legitimizes it. So that's fine, we can all buy toilet rolls because they're buying toilet rolls. So you've got this accumulation of behaviors called social proof. And that led to the disruption of conventional supply chains in a significant way. If you looked at supply chains, you'll know the concept of the bullwhip effect, which is kind of the sort of the consequences of an unpredictable change in demand. Now, having said that, despite all this, supply chains were actually pretty resilient. There weren't starving people in the streets, trying to find food. Retail supply chains generally held up very, very well, particularly for foodstuffs. There was perhaps a little less choice, but actually it worked pretty well. The other factor, of course, was the availability of product from regular suppliers like China. And these charts here show the kind of port volumes and the volatility, because of the lockdown in China, of the volume of trade that was allowed to move between China and the rest of the world. And the headline there, Shanghai's grim COVID outbreak threatens more global supply chain disruption. So the best retailers learned to be resilient, learned to manage volatility, and had to accept some costs in that process. Second theme of VUCA is complexity. And the example I want to use is that of the online experience. Because, again, if you'd look back 18 months, most commentators were saying stores are dead. The move online is irreversible. In the UK, we saw an exponential increase in retail sales online as a percentage of all retail sales, from about 19% to about 35%. So this is the UK data. Non-food is in blue here. And you can see the spike at the first lockdown in March 2020 for non-food sales online. 45% of all non-food retail sales were being conducted online. And everyone looked at that spike and said, well, that's it, there's no going back. Stores are dead. And yet, that created a number of challenges for firms. Moving to that level of online penetration was enormously challenging for organisations. Ocado, which is a UK-based online-only grocery retailer, at one point had a waiting list of 1 million people waiting to sign online. And I remember I took this screenshot of a home improvement retailer called B&Q in the UK, where I was waiting in a queue to get to the website in mid-March because there was so much demand for online. So the agility of firms to respond quickly to these kinds of trends was extremely variable. But added to that, we have a commercial problem with this kind of move. And there are two quotes here that kind of illustrate that. One is from the chief executive of one of our leading clothing retailers, Next, who said at the end of 2020, last year, every pound of our business that transferred from retail to online cost an additional 6 pence. In other words, 6% increase in costs. In the short to medium term, the cost of structural change will persist. In other words, it was costing them 6% more to reach the same customer using an online channel. And this business, as we'll go on to hear, is actually one of the best practice omni-channel retail organisations in the UK. And yet it was costing them long-term, structurally, an extra 6%. And one of the leading grocers, Sainsbury's, comments that moving sales out of our most profitable convenience channel, as they had to do, and this little peak here shows that for food retail, and driving a huge step up in online grocery participation, our least profitable channel. So they were deliberately moving customers out of profitability in terms of channels through to less profitable ways of reaching people. So it's a complex trade-off, a complex set of issues for firms, and let alone what happens if I'd just shown you that chart up into there, trying to predict what would have happened after this point. Extremely difficult. In fact, what happened was when the lockdown was lifted, the non-food online sales dropped significantly. The second lockdown, it rose again and fell again. If you look at the long-term trend, you see it's just about in line with the long-term average growth. So all the commentators that were saying stores are dead were actually wrong. And if we look at Sweden by comparison with the UK, what I've done here is try and take the same data sources for the UK and for Sweden, and red is e-commerce product sales, blue is store-based sales. You can see in the UK, by 2020, the kind of the strong growth in online, but actually, following that lockdown period, the slow growth of store-based sales alongside online sales. So it hasn't been the death knell of stores. In Sweden, it's less clear because the penetration levels are lower, but you see a same kind of trend with store-based sales still inching up a little bit with overall sales. Though I think, in fact, it slipped in the last couple of months. So the question for retailers is, what is the long-term equilibrium? Much of the growth came from new adopters, people who hadn't wanted to shop online, who were actually quite reluctant online traders, and ended up having to do it. And the reason they didn't like doing it was because of all the reasons we know. Use of technology was unfamiliar to them. They didn't have the right credit card details. They didn't have a mobile phone. They simply preferred shopping in store for the social interactions and so on. So the question was, how many of those new adopters would stick when stores reopened? And then, of course, we have the fact that these are not early adopters. They're more likely to be unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the online experience than others, because they really prefer the store-based experience. So, really complex kind of buying situations here. And at the same time, we saw that lockdown period in both countries leading to the growth of new business models. Direct-to-consumer growth became more feasible for suppliers. And other new business models, including the Q-commerce or quick commerce, grocery express services, started to see some major growth. But again, how long will it be before we see what the long-term balance, the long-term equilibrium will be from this complex set of circumstances? Then let's think about ambiguity. So the example I have here is the impact on places. So one of the things that we noticed in many markets was the resilience of local places by comparison with large cities during the pandemic. We noticed that people worked from home, of course, and therefore the retailers in their locality benefited from their patronage. The recovery in larger cities was much, much slower. And if I show you this chart, which shows for Germany, the UK and Sweden, and for the capital cities of each, how far mobility has returned to pre-pandemic conditions. What you see is that in retailing, it's between kind of 3% and 11% still below pre-pandemic levels of mobility for retail purchasing. But if you look at London, or if you look at Stockholm, you see the poorer performance is much higher in those cities. So in the capital cities, the larger metropolises, much less willingness to come in to shop in those sorts of locations. And we see it for supermarkets and pharmacy to a lesser extent, and for workplaces too. And of course, the workplace story conceals what's actually going on here, which is that many people have continued to work from home. And a lot of people are saying they're not coming back. Perhaps 2 days a week if you're lucky, is the kind of the sense we get in the UK sometimes. And so there's a slower recovery of transport hubs, of tourist places, of larger towns and cities. And for the retailers in those locations, what do? Do you wait for the recovery to come through? Or do you take a risk, close those stores or that operation and move to where the customers currently are working from home? Maybe too risky to do that too soon. So we have that element, and we also have the fact that many people, when they worked from home locally, discovered the attractiveness of local provenance of food and localism more generally. And so in some sense we became less metropolitan, less cosmopolitan in our outlook. And we like to buy artisan products from our village and from our local town where we live, rather than from where we used to work on a daily basis. And that's had a very significant impact on the locational strategies of many firms. So the economic legacy of COVID has been really polarizing. We've seen some really substantial changes in the way in which markets have emerged from lockdown and from the pandemic, and the economic consequences of that. So this chart shows for 4 markets, China, US, UK and Sweden, from going back to 2020, the extent of lockdowns, if you like, the extent of containment within those economies. And you can see Sweden was pretty liberal during this period here, even compared to the UK, which released lockdowns quite early, certainly more so than the US and substantially more so than China, of course. And that creates different kinds of environments for retailers to make strategic decisions. So we see these kind of polarizations, if you like, of economic impact on the consumer, on retail businesses, and on channels. And it's a real challenge to know, who will be the winners and who will be the losers from this. So let's think a bit about the longer term challenges of change, and I might just pause at this point and just see if there are any comments or questions from that section. Any thoughts or observations? Do you recognise this? Yeah.
You named that in London and Berlin and Stockholm, retail recovers slower compared to the overall nation, and you named tourism as one possible factor.
Well, commuting as well, I think.
And
yes.
Commuting, but
Yeah.
are there any more factors taken into account, such as an increase in rent or
yes, I mean,
spending power?
Well, we've seen the cost of living impact that I'll talk about in this, one of my first long-term challenges, which I think has affected many economies in the last 6 to 8 months since the Ukraine-Russia war started. But I think also you can look at simply the lack of willingness of some shoppers still to be seen in large crowds, and so avoiding what they would regard as particularly busy places. So London especially, when I was there in 2020, 2021, people would avoid the underground because they didn't want to be in an enclosed space with lots of people breathing on them, and they walked above ground everywhere. And they would actively avoid going to shopping centres or to locations where they expected to find large amounts of people. What you also found was people did sort of smash and grab raids in the early days. So they would, rather than go frequently and spend a little money each time, they would actually have a purposive shopping trip, spend a lot more money as a group. That's why I call it smash and grab. They kind of rush into the store, buy everything they wanted and rush out again, because that was the safest way of actually shopping, but still getting the benefit of being in the store. So I think there are a variety of reasons. I'd still say, though, that it's the commuting shortfall for London, certainly. I can't speak to Stockholm or to Berlin, but the commuting shortfall in London that has been the real destructive influence on retail turnover in that time. Okay, so the longer term challenges of change. What I wanted to do in this section was really, again, to emphasise this notion that the retail industry globally is in this era of profound, and again, perhaps it's it's a little kind of hubristic to say, but perhaps unprecedented change. This is something that I wrote about in a recent book earlier this year, which talks really about the kinds of challenges that retail organisations are facing. And I wanted to take each of these in turn and talk through some of the specific characteristics of each challenge and some examples of firms that have dealt well with this and firms that haven't. And I hope that, given the breadth of the projects that you're doing, one or more of these will hit the spot in terms of being useful to you in your thinking. So let's start off with the economic challenge. And clearly, one of the things that we're absolutely facing up to in the last 3 months or so is cost and price inflation. So for retail firms, for Sweden, we've got the highest inflation rate in over 30 years, at 10.9% in October, and even higher, I suspect, for some products, particularly sort of foodstuffs. In the UK, we're similarly on around about 10.9%, I think, possibly even 11%, 11.1%, and 15% or 20% for some foodstuffs. So very, very substantial increase in price. And for a retailer, this is an unprecedented challenge. Most retail managers, I'd say nearly all retail managers, none of them will really have experienced a high inflationary economic environment before. They won't have the tools or the skills or the experience to know what are the strategies for dealing with high inflation. How do you persuade people to buy things still from you? How do you get market share? How do you play the business as usual game when inflation is anything from 11% upwards? It's an enormous challenge in terms of the skills that retailers need to acquire. And as I say, certain food prices were set to rise by up to 50% in the UK during that period. So what we see is a very different kind of situation. This is some of you will, with sharp eyesight, notice that the scales are different on this. So, in fact, we're running at about the same level in terms of inflation in the UK and Sweden. But I think historically you were actually running a little bit higher than us up until the pandemic. But this is the interesting chart, because what this talks about is EU retail sales, volume and value. And what this demonstrates actually is that you're spending more money, we're getting less stuff, in effect. And that gap is opening up. So the sense about what is value for money starts to become very sensitive to consumers. And that is a major issue for firms to deal with. And then, of course, we have increased commodity prices. The chart on the right shows the extent to which prices pre-pandemic have multiplied for basic commodities. So in the case of natural gas, currently 4.2 times pre-pandemic levels, but it got as high as 6 times. For wheat, nearly 2 times. For soybeans, 1.5. For nickel, 1.8. For Brent crude oil, more than twice. So that kind of commodity inflation and the impact on energy costs of the Ukraine war, and this shows that figure for the UK, with petrol and energy bills being the blue part of that inflationary climb there, fundamentally changing the way consumers think about what is value for money and how much they're willing to spend and what they're willing to spend it on. Then, if we look at energy specifically, we can see that different countries have different exposures to the Russian energy supply market. I think Sweden, this is from 2019, so this will have changed a little bit as strategies have been put in place to try and safeguard energy supplies. But Sweden was relatively well off compared to, for example, Hungary or the Netherlands or Finland in terms of reliance on oil or gas from Russia. And that's led to very different kinds of economic environments in those markets as they sought to adjust energy supplies, and policies have differed enormously in terms of how energy costs are subsidised by governments and by others. And I was saying to Ulf last night that energy costs are becoming such a significant factor in the UK at the moment that retailers are actually turning the lights down. So I was in Sainsbury's last week, big food store. They changed the light setting to the overnight stocking light levels. So it was like walking into a cave, with a few spotlights. And I'm sure that was partly public relations to say, look, we're doing our bit rather than saving money. But it demonstrates that even retailers are having to take some quite difficult decisions about store environments and so on to keep trading during these kinds of conditions. And not surprisingly, consumer confidence is not what it was. Now we do have very different scales on this chart. So we've got Swedish consumer confidence in blue and UK consumer confidence in the dotted line. But it's important to say that the UK has always been more pessimistic than Swedish consumers. Okay, so the Swedish numbers are all positive, and the UK numbers are all negative. Okay, so we have more pessimists than optimists in the UK, and you have more optimists than pessimists in Sweden, apparently, according to this. But the trends are the same. So we can see that the confidence levels in both countries has fallen to an all-time low in the last 2 or 3 months. And that's a very significant drop from kind of March this year through to the end of the year. And that, of course, means that retailers have to empathise with consumers' lack of confidence and encourage them to spend appropriately. And again, here's an ad from Tesco in the UK, and their normal strapline is "every little helps," but what they don't hear is to say, right now, every little helps. That's why we price match hundreds of products that matter most to you. So they're now price matching basic products like bread and vegetables and butter and so on. We can see also in Sweden, although GDP was strong, there are gathering concerns about the future prospects for the economy. So this means, when put all together, that retailers are facing some really significant long-term economic challenges. So how have companies responded? Well, they've responded with price discounting to try and keep sales going, but that's usually at the expense of margins. They've responded with a sort of advisory pieces about how to spend wisely. They've responded with preventing the firms from putting up prices. So Primark is taking a £1 billion hit on its margins by not increasing prices for its consumers. And in some cases, the retailer has failed altogether. So clothes retailer Victoria Beckham's business has been sold after racking up debt, and ASOS, the online clothing retailer, is doing some different things. It's opening a pop-up high street stores to sell clothes at a discount, its surplus inventory through physical stores in the UK. And yet some are doing pretty well. So although Primark is not increasing its prices, the queues outside Primark are very substantial still. So retailers are acting in different ways, through discounting, through freezing prices, through closing stores or closing their businesses altogether in many cases. In the case of online businesses, trying to find store-based ways for selling product. The other component of economic challenges is really around talent. And this is a more insidious challenge for firms. What we again have seen in many European countries, including the UK, is a post-pandemic increase in vacancies. People falling out of the labour market, either because of long-term illness like COVID, because of other health conditions that hadn't been treated because of the focus on COVID, or simply because they got to an age where they say, well, I quite like working from home, I might just live at home rather than work from home. So in the UK we've lost something like 500,000 people from the workforce, over 50. And for retailing that's quite important because those individuals had higher social skills, they were good at what they did in store in terms of service levels, and those have gone from the system. And so the number of vacancies in retailing and hospitality, particularly in the UK, is very, very significant and has affected service levels, particularly in hospitality, quite a lot. And so companies have tried to slim down the workforce. So Tesco here taking out 1,000 roles of nighttime shelf stocking to replace it with daytime work, which is cheaper. Thinking more about hybrid working and reducing working hours in the week to provide more flexible employment opportunities for firms. But we still have the situation where we have a skill shortage for certain occupations. And of course, if we think further ahead, the challenge is then, well, will this labour supply come back? Or do we have to make some quite tough decisions about replacing people with technology? Because this has implications for retail automation. If we're taking people out of the workforce or they're dropping out of the workforce, how do you maintain service levels? So self-scanning checkouts, click and collect opportunities, shrinking the remit of the physical workforce, in some cases providing robot assistance in stores even, shelf edge labelling and so on automated. So thinking about investing in capital substitution for labour is a really important response to the labour market challenges that many companies are facing. The second challenge, I think we'll cover this and we'll take a break at 5, and I think in the usual way. The second challenge is what I've called broadly a consumer challenge, but in some senses all these challenges are ultimately consumer challenges. But this particular one, I've tried to demonstrate one or two tensions that exist between what consumers say they want and the way they behave in practice. So the first of these tensions is between convenience and sustainability. And we know, absolutely, particularly here in Sweden, the reality of the need to be more sustainable, the demand for resources, which is water shortage affecting nearly 4 billion people worldwide, the cost of climate change, the need for firms to develop more resilient strategies to deal with this situation. And what does it mean for retailing? Well, it means for retailing that retailers have to be seen to be responding, not just following the empty rhetoric, the greenwashing. Have to be seen to be responding to these kinds of challenges. And what we start to see is companies trying experiments or trying new kinds of business models. I've just chosen one here, which is Marks and Spencer in the UK, doing what many companies are doing worldwide now, and that is hiring out clothes to cost-conscious shoppers rather than selling them clothes. So this meets the dual goal of being, sustainable, but also for those families or those individuals who are facing cost concerns, cost-conscious concerns. It's an economic solution for them as well. So this business called Hire Street is doing this. And I see also there are a couple of very interesting vintage chains that are opening up across Europe, one called Vinted, which I think has just opened in Sweden, which is a website designed purely for recycling clothing in a kind of organised way, kind of eBay for clothing, but a slightly more upmarket one, where you can kind of market your t-shirts and jackets and trousers. And student markets are actually very lucrative ones for this second-hand clothing activity. So convenience versus sustainability. So the choice being, can I have my cake and eat it too? Can I be sustainable, but can I also meet my needs for convenience in this process? And we see some tensions pulling this apart. So in the UK, IKEA is experimenting as elsewhere with its recycling of furniture, its circular hubs. We see a lot of growth in vintage clothing, second-hand clothing businesses. This one is student-centric. It's called We Are Second Life Fashion, and it's recycling vintage merchandise to student campuses, to outlets, just on student campuses across the UK. Very different kind of business model. And its marketing is entirely through social media. On the other hand, we have this kind of horrific business model called Q-commerce. You have these operations in Sweden, I think, to some extent in the larger cities, but in the UK, during the pandemic, this became a very fashionable way of ordering a pint of milk and paying a lot of money for it. So Q-commerce, or quick commerce, was estimated worldwide to be worth around about $14 billion. It's rapid grocery delivery. So if you wanted, let's say, didn't want to go out in the rain and you were short of a pint of milk, you'd use your phone, buy a pint of milk, and it would come with a 20 pence delivery charge on top of the price of the pint, brought by one of these organisations. And you can see in the map of London, there's my map, the locations of all these dark stores that were picking and packing and delivering for a price all these items. Now, what's happened in the last year or so, in the same way that online sales have fallen, is that we've seen these companies have real difficulty gaining market share. There are too many of them, and consumer demand has slipped away from the convenience piece. People can't afford the 20 pence for the extra pint of milk, and actually they also feel a bit guilty about doing it because they don't think it's a very sustainable option. So consumer sentiment and consumer affordability has meant these businesses are now in big trouble. But they illustrate a kind of tension between consumer behaviours that are around about sustainability and those that are around, I want to have it now. And Amazon is a classic example of this, of course, with Amazon Prime and next day delivery and so on, although the business is trying to tackle that by removing cardboard, by using electric vans and so on to try and minimise its environmental impact. But it's still a very inefficient and environmentally unfriendly way of delivering goods and services. So the final example in this piece is where the tension really came to a head in North London, which is where you find probably the consumers who are the most conflicted. They're very wealthy, they worry about sustainability, but they can also afford the quick commerce. They can also afford to buy from the high-end grocery stores like Waitrose or Ocado. And Ocado wanted to develop a distribution centre in the heart of this wealthy enclave. And of course, these poor residents were in complete disarray because on the one hand, they wanted to support a sustainable solution and therefore didn't want a distribution centre. On the other hand, they wanted convenient luxury food, please. And in the end, sustainability won out. Ocado lost its court case to build a distribution centre. So all the time you see these trade-offs, these tensions, in this case between convenience and sustainability. The second trade-off is a more obvious one, and one that many retailers continually worry about, which is the notion of the trade-off between convenience and experience. And for a number of years I've been promoting this particular case study of the ultimate inconvenience. This is a mobile convenience store, unmanned convenience store from China called Bingo Box. And when this was first launched in 2017, they were aiming at building 500 stores. They were tiny units, completely self-contained. What I might try and do is run the video of this. I'm not sure if we'll get much sound out of it, but we'll see what we can get. But you'll get a sense, if you haven't seen this before, of what these operations were like.
有未支付商品，请放回货架。
Shoplifter.
发现陌生人进入。
So I showed that, it looks very impressive, it looks wonderful actually. But of course this didn't really survive the pandemic in China. So with lockdowns and so on, this business was meant to be at 500 stores in about 2 years. They raised some good startup money, but they were unable to make it work for them. But I think it's a great example because the ambition was there to be convenience where you want it. This is a mobile unmanned convenience store, meeting local customers' needs in a very inexpensive way for the retailer, because one person could actually look after 40 of these stores. You saw the person on the screen there. In fact, the current versions are face-activated entry rather than a QR code. But I checked earlier this year, the website's a little creaky. It's still working, it's still there, but I think it's limping through the pandemic. But what this shows is, with these kinds of convenience operations, you can have, a convenient experience, in a sense. This is exactly what you want. It's the right kind of experience for the right type of convenience. And the data that this produces for the company is really where they have the real advantage in being able to understand what is selling well, what is not selling well. They use the wand to actually look at inventory levels and stock up overnight. So it's a really interesting example of the kind of ultimate inconvenience. And I'll finish with just a couple of experience examples. So I mentioned Primark, and Primark I think is a great example of a business that has, in some senses, convenience is not relevant. It's about the experience. People will travel a long way to get to Primark because it's the lowest cost provider in the clothing market in many countries. They rather cheekily opened in Milan earlier this year. I went to have a look at the store when I was there last time, and on a Monday morning it was absolutely packed with customers, which is very unusual for a clothing retailer. So extraordinarily popular. And this is a very bad photograph I took when lockdown was first released in Oxford. This is Oxford Shopping Centre, the Westgate Centre, and there is a queue for Primark, and it goes, you can't see it, it goes right round the shopping centre to get into Primark. People were so eager to get back into stores to get the experience, the buzz. Stores are opening earlier and earlier. They're extraordinarily busy. This is Primark in Birmingham in the UK at 7 a.m. In April this year, and internationally too. So this particular Primark is in Madrid. It's in an old department store, and you wouldn't think that discount clothing could be sold in such an exciting kind of experiential environment. It's a wonderful building. And it's got packed with all kinds of service environment tricks and of the trade, cafes, services of all kinds and so on. Really very, very successful. And the final example, we'll take a short break, in the consumer challenge is also in Madrid. This is a business called Wow, which again is built in a former department store, but it's what this guy here, Dinas, calls phygital, a combination between physical and digital, which is almost as awful a word as omnichannel, I have to say. But this is trying to bring together the digital environment with the physical environment in a store. And again, we'll just finish this section of the talk with a short video. It's in Spanish, so there are subtitles, I think.
Yo creo que es más que una tienda porque tiene este tipo de producto que es totalmente exclusivo, de tendencia y novedoso, pero también lo es porque es el primer gran formato de retail que integra totalmente el canal físico y el digital en uno solo, ¿no? Nosotros podemos hacer en un espacio físico una compra o una experiencia de compra totalmente digitalizada. De hecho, es todavía algo muy incipiente, que sin duda Wow Concept lo que va a hacer va a ser evolucionarlo y llevarlo a que sea una realidad, pero yo creo que después de nosotros esto se va a ir extendiendo cada vez más y yo creo que se va a ir acogiendo por la industria de manera generalizada. No tiene ningún sentido no darse cuenta de que todo esto tiene que integrarse, que no va a haber experiencias solo físicas, solo digitales, y que hacerlo de forma correcta y que funcione creo que es clave. Así que yo creo que el digital no solamente es una realidad, sino que ha venido para quedarse.
I'll show you that just to give an example of the kind of things that startup money is now attracting in big cities. And this particular example, I think, claims to have lots of brands already signed up for the store. It's almost as busy, although the video doesn't really show it, it's almost as busy as the Primark store the last time I was in Madrid. And I think is, again, a good example of where experience has won out over convenience. And the final bit on this is, of course, the online offer. What's happened to that in terms of experience and convenience? Well, the very interesting thing about that is that lots of businesses overinvested in distribution centres and warehouses during the pandemic because they thought online growth was here to stay. What's become very clear is it's not at the levels that it was previously at during the pandemic. And even Amazon has realised that it's commissioned too many warehouses in Europe and North America, so it's pulling back on much of its warehouse building strategy, and indeed may well have destroyed the warehouse market as a consequence of that, because they've pulled out of so many deals, the bottom has fallen out of the market. At the same time, they are putting more emphasis on to physical presence. And you know about whole food markets, you know about their experiments in bookstores and so on. Amazon Style, of which there are now 2 outlets, I think, in the States, is again their kind of demonstrable experiment to bring the best of Amazon AI and machine learning to bear on the clothing market within North America. And I think this is a great example of actually evidence that stores can work and do work when they run well. What I find amusing is that Amazon can't run stores. They're pretty good at running websites, but they haven't got the skill set to run stores effectively. But this is better than many of their previous efforts in this regard. Okay, we'll get started again. Thanks for everyone coming back. Before we start, any questions on the last section? Any questions or observations on the last section? We had some comment about Amazon's environmental credentials, which I think is a very good question. The question was, what can Amazon do, given the business model it has, to actually become more environmentally friendly in terms of its footprint? And the answer is, it doesn't have that in its gift, in a sense. It can do some things. It can remove cardboard from packaging. It can invest in the massive electrical vehicle fleet. But the business model is inherently inefficient in that sense, whereas break of bulk conventional store-based retailing is significantly more environmentally friendly in some respects. And of course, what happens is that Amazon shoppers buy things on Amazon for the next day delivery, and the time they save, they still go out in their cars to do other shopping. So there's no net saving of environmental footprint in that respect. Okay, let's move on to the last 2 challenges, and the third one is around technology, and we've already touched a bit on technology as we've gone through, and you'll notice there's an overlap between some of these themes to some extent. And the challenge, of course, for retailers is dealing with the overlay of all these challenges arriving at once, hence the term kind of polycrisis in a sense. But if we look at technology, then of course, a bit like the Spanish flu example, retailing has always been driven by technological change. Whether it was the railways of the 19th century, the maritime transport of the 18th and 19th centuries, the invention of ice storage, protected storage areas in ships to bring perishable merchandise across from India and Asia to Europe. And And we've seen in the 20th century the growth of the motor car, determining where stores are located and their accessibility and the size of those stores, distribution centres, and the growth of the economies of scale that led to the multiple retail chain. And the technologies are quite astounding in some cases. So we have the new refrigerator, the Kelvinator. This was one of the first tills. It came actually from a guy called James Ritty, who in the 19th century had observed how on ships captains could influence the engine room by pulling a lever, and there'd be an echo in the engine room downstairs for full speed or whatever. This is a very similar activity. So by pressing these keys, it would signal to the payment finance team upstairs, that a sale was being made, and it reduced the scope for staff theft, amongst other things. Now, Ritty didn't make a lot of money out of this. Actually, he ended up bankrupt and penniless because he'd sold the rights to NCR, National Cash Registers, and they made a lot of money out of selling cash registers to retailers. And then finally, the moving staircase is a piece of technology that allowed multi-storey retailers to be more easily established. And these were so novel in 19th century Victorian Britain that in Harrods, when this was first installed in Harrods, they had to position sales assistants at the top of the escalators with smelling salts because people fainted with the excitement of going up the escalator. And they got to the top and fell over because it was so thrilling. It's a bit like kind of virtual reality today, when you've got your headset on and something happens. So again, what goes around comes around. That we have this theory in retailing, the wheel of retailing. I think we can see some of that echoed in these kinds of technologies. And when we look ahead at the forthcoming challenges, it's equally to be faced with some things we've seen before, but also some new things. So, a bit like the environmental challenge I talked about earlier before the break, we can think about longer term technological challenges, things that we're not dealing with yet, but we'll soon have to. Things like advances in human augmentation, where we actually have improved capabilities, whether that's sensory, physical, or cognition, because of implants or other technological devices. So rather than having Google on your phone, you have Google in your head, basically. Or you have the ability to carry lots of shopping bags because you're physically augmented, or the ability to understand a particular buying opportunity because your intelligence has been augmented. So we can start to see those kinds of advances coming through in 10 to 25 years' time, I suppose. But equally, just as we've become used to having computing facilities and the Internet of Things in the last 5 years, so we may start to see robots and unmanned systems being as ubiquitous as computers have become today, where pretty well everything we pick up has more intelligence than that early computer I showed you on the slide before, that one there. You can have that now in your fingernail pretty well. And yet we still have future challenges to deal with. So we have Ocado's automated distribution centres in the UK, and they're now selling the system. They're making more money out of selling the technology than they are selling grocery goods. So Kroger in the States is using this. A couple of French retailers, Australian retailers have bought the system of these little kind of robots that are automated pick and pack for small grocery goods. And this is great until the warehouse catches fire, which one did in the UK a couple of years ago. And they cost about 20 million to build these things. But they're designed for robots, not for human beings. So the fire brigade couldn't get in to put the fire out, and it burnt to the ground with all the robots. All the robots died, so it's very sad. So there are some risks to building these kinds of warehouses. But we also see, looking further ahead, clearly the metaverse, and I'll talk a bit about it in a few seconds, what's called volumetric telepresence, which is a little bit like holography. So Google has been experimenting with this, where you have the image of somebody in a glass in front of you that looks as real as if they're in the room with you. So it's if you like, it's Zoom on steroids, if you like, 3D Zoom, and logistics and supply chain innovation. So this is a patent that Amazon took out 5 years ago, actually, for a drone hive. Looks like a beehive, but lorries go in at the bottom and drones come out at the top with goods for people. And and the drones tap on the window when they find your mobile phone signal and try and deliver to you directly. So, what are the implications for retailing of these kinds of technologies? What will we as shoppers be able to do or experience with an enhanced cognitive function or with immediate access to augmented reality through whatever devices we might have, whether those are glasses, contact lenses, or implants? And we might think Google Glass was a failure, but it was a matter of timing, I think, rather than actual failure per se. And what's the potential, for example, for retailers to understand, as a result of the data gathering that's possible from these kinds of technologies, genuinely how consumers are behaving and how they are reacting to different marketing stimuli. So there's a phenomenal opportunity out there in many respects, but a worrying one in many other respects. So let's deal with the metaverse. Now, if you're an optimist, you're kind of up there. If you're a pessimist, you're down here. Okay? So I might ask you to put your hands up in a few moments just to see who falls into which camp. But Nancy Bergen, who's Senior Vice President at Hearst Media, the metaverse will become the next social network. However, Forbes magazine, Richard Kestenbaum, until technology improves, the metaverse will still be mostly talk. So who do we believe? So just hands up, who thinks Nancy is closer to the truth? And who thinks Richard is closer to the truth? I think Richard has it by an edge, yeah? So there are more kind of realistic analysts in the room than perhaps I might have expected. I thought we might have been a little more even between the two of you, but actually that's very interesting. Because when you look at the data on this, you find that firms are indeed experimenting. So H&M, Selfridges, Balenciaga is working with Fortnite on getting its brands into the gamification environment. And Carrefour is working with Twitch to develop gamified grocery shopping. You ever thought about thinking about grocery shopping as a bit like I'm a celebrity, get me out of here, the kind of sort of celebrity contest? Let's see if I can get this to work. I'll show you what it looks like. It's a whole new world of grocery shopping.
Peggy 12.
The trick here is to eat healthy. So that's the game, that's the challenge. So ever thought that grocery shopping could be so exciting? So firms are experimenting. The evidence so far is that it's not really capturing the imagination of the consumer, but you have to experiment to find these things out. What was quite dispiriting was to see that Meta, for example, its Reality Labs division, which has been responsible for building the metaverse, which I think Zuckerberg would quite like to wholly own as a Meta property, has spent no less than $15 billion on the metaverse to date since 2021. That's in 2 years, 15 billion. But average revenues, less than $30 million a quarter, and perhaps 200,000 people worldwide using it. So that's a very expensive per customer kind of cost at the moment. And the evidence is of those 200,000, that's a one-off visit, not a return visit. So a customer base that tends to, quote, experience the metaverse once and never return. I mean, why would you go into a virtual environment where you had no legs, for example? It's just bizarre. Yeah.
Do you think that Carrefour is going into the metaverse more because of the brand building of just being innovative and diving into this, or are they actually trying to make a real effort at finding an extra avenue for content?
I think it has to be brand building initially. I think just saying we're here, and we're relevant to you at the moment. I think the technology that would be required to convert that into ordering bananas, is going to be quite an expensive one, and I suspect that would eat up the margin on bananas quite significantly. But I could see how you could do that as a longer term goal once you built the brand reputation in the format, in the channel. Particularly if you gamify it in the way that they have, so it becomes almost a sort of a brand challenge, and they have winners and league tables of healthy consumers and so on. So you actually have to buy the stuff to take part in the competition, for example. You could see ways in which you could tie those two things together. But it's a great question, and I think the experience I've had of this stuff, let's see, about 10 years ago, there was a business called Second Life in North America that predated much of broadband access on the internet, and they were far better than the metaverse that Zuckerberg has designed in terms of the experience, the lived experience, but the bandwidth wasn't there to have a good experience. But you found luxury clothing retailers did quite well, actually, in that sort of environment, because it's quite exclusive. You had to be quite well off to afford the network connections and the bandwidth to do that. And people like LVMH used it, Gucci used it to try and build brand, and again to demonstrate that they could engage with a different kind of audience, the ones that they'd been used to in stores. So I think you could see it. I mean, I think the Balenciaga one is a better example than Carrefour, because you can see how Balenciaga could use it to leverage their way into a new demographic for the brand. But I think the jury is still out, and I think retailers have to experiment in these areas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these experiments will be successful. I suppose the view is, as long as Zuckerberg is spending the money rather than the retailer, that's fine, to create these kinds of environments. And then, of course, what we can do with these is get away from physical product and have virtual product. Anyone bought any virtual clothing in the group? No? Okay. Can do. If you have an avatar in a virtual environment, you can buy clothing for them. And you can use non-fungible tokens to pay for it. So you can have an exclusive access to a piece of clothing like this, which is probably physically impossible to construct, with conventional materials, but you can do it virtually. And the fabricant is a Dutch digital fashion house. There's one of a number of firms that are set up to actually create digital clothing, which has value, which people are willing to pay to own some ones and zeros that they put on their avatar. So very curious sort of opportunities. And again, you think about, well, how familiar a story would that be to a conventional store manager, for example, in a retail store? When I've shown this to practitioners, they can't actually get their heads around the idea, let alone think about how their businesses could use this in an extension of their business model. Why would people pay for pretend clothing? It's interesting. So the metaverse, I think, is a really interesting. There we go. There's a nice 3D rendering of that rather splendid item. And again, it's a designer concept. So this is a limited edition. Probably about 150 of these being made, as it were, with NFTs to pay for them. So that's going right out on the edge. Let's come back into a bit more of sort of immediate opportunity. And this is a UK-based business that I remember talking to the founder pre-pandemic, about 5 years ago, a guy called John Hoyle. And he was in despair because he got some startup money, but he couldn't get shopping centre managers interested in letting out space in their centres to his concept. And his concept is basically a micro tenancy model for physical space. So you can rent the space for half an hour rather than take it for 25 years. This allows you to focus your product or your service at exactly the right time in the day or the day of the week when your customers are likely to be around. So it's a very efficient, from a rental point of view, way of configuring your space. And because it's digitized, it's a phygital environment. This can be customized in a few lines of code to create the right look and feel for the particular product or service that's being sold, whether that's a yoga class or a craft retailer or a hairdresser. So it's a very interesting model for vacant space. And so you focus on only times when the target audience is out and about. So in high value retail hours, Souk is a shop. In the morning it's a gym. At lunchtime it's a bank. In the evenings it's an event space. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about the use of physical space with technology to strengthen the flexibility of the offer. And Souk has now gone from being a very anxious first-time startup entrepreneur that I met 5 years ago to being courted on all the major conference platforms for retailing. So he's the go-to person to give the latest case study about what's working in retail and technology. And it's great because he's gone from sort of no stores to about 5 in the space of 6 months, and he's got endless offers to develop new ones. He's only constrained by the size of his team. So it's interesting to see how the flavour can change when the environment changes in terms of technology. Now, of course, a lot of this technology also relies on data and AI and machine learning. And so we should spend a bit of time thinking about AI and the potential contribution of AI to retail. Now, if you think about information systems, well, here's a very early information system from 1799. Well, the photograph isn't, but the invention of pneumatic tubes used for this purpose goes back to 1799 in Germany, I think. And they're transport systems for information. So this is, if you like, the physical internet. So department stores use this kind of system a lot. Chemists used it. They used it to protect money. So money would be shot up to the cash office upstairs, so it couldn't be stolen, and a receipt would come down the other way. Requests for new products would also go up there. So this is a rudimentary information system, if you like. In fact, the quote comes from a 21st century company that is still offering pneumatic tube transport. But let's think about what we see today. Well, first of all, artificial intelligence. Well, the problem with AI, is it artificial? Is it intelligent? Almost certainly not. It's not really intelligent. Wim Noorder from Maastricht is a critic. He says it's essentially correlation analysis, looking for patterns in data. It's not kind of self-aware. Whereas, by contrast, human brains, which are often used as the analogy for AI, are actually storytelling devices generating explanations for the patterns that are seen. So that's the distinction between, in effect, machine learning and what AI could be in a generation's time. I still prefer this quote, which is Bill Bulko from Texas, who says, AI, the art of making computers that behave like the ones in the movies, which I think is great, if you've seen a few of those films. What can this do? Well, here's a current example of that. This is Stitch Fix from the US. And in their annual report a few years back, a couple of years ago, they put in a great example of how they use data, predictive analytics, to forecast and monitor the use of the service by a particular customer. In this case, it's Laura, is the example, 37 years old. She's a doctor from Indiana. And it traces her activity with Stitch Fix from September 2013 right the way through to September 2018. And it goes through 2 pregnancies, return to work, and signing up the children to buy from the service. And they know exactly when she bought what. They know exactly what life stage she was at by what she bought from Stitch Fix. And the machine learning algorithm was around saying, well, okay, we know people like Laura at this stage in return to work would want to buy these clothes around about now, so we'll send her an offer. So they were using predictive analytics based on Laura's demographics to forecast what others would want to buy at that stage in their life stage. And over that time, Laura spent $12,000 on 210 items in 49 kind of packages or fixes. So machine learning can be extraordinarily useful in providing the ability to predict and detect patterns of buying behavior. What it can't do is provide the kind of human judgment. So what Stitch Fix does, in addition to predicting this stuff, is before a fix goes out, a package of goods goes out, a human buyer will actually check the order and the profile of the customer to make sure it feels about right. They'll use their human judgment to augment that of the machine learning algorithm. And then we go right out again. So here is a brilliant example. And I might, if I'm feeling bold, I might try and get Viola to talk to us. But this is where you could end up. So for a number of years, we've had the ability to develop specialized AI. So AIs that can do very specific things. So Google demonstrated, for example, an AI that was indistinguishable from the person you would call to make a hairdressing appointment. And they fooled everybody that used it. And why do they fool them? Well, the voice was very natural and real, but there were limited choices. So all you had to ask is, what kind of appointment do you want? When do you want it? And you just had to exchange polite conversation between times. So a specialized AI could be trained to do that. Far more difficult is a generalized AI that can respond to any kind of question. Now, we've got any time? I think I might just try this. I might cut it out of the video, but we'll see if we can get Viola online. I think it might take a little bit of time, but let me just try this very quickly to see if I can get it working over the network here. Might be blocked. Hi, Viola.
Hi, I'm Viola. I'm one example of a digital person. I'm designed to help you explore the world. Ask me a where, what, who, why, or how question, and let's see where we go.
Hi, Viola. Where is Copenhagen?
Wow, that's interesting. From Wolfram Alpha, Hawaii is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It shares borders with the Pacific Ocean. Vella is located in Basilicata, Italy.
Thank you.
Copenhagen is located in Denmark.
There we go. So we got 3 choices there. Thank you very much indeed, Viola. Very helpful. Goodbye. No.
Sorry, I can't answer that.
No, you can't. Bad luck, Viola. So let's just quit Viola. Yes, thank you. We'll go back to the slide, which is far safer. I got myself into a very awkward situation when I was demonstrating Viola recently. A generalized AI, clearly there's a lot of work to be done on this, but in terms of verisimilitude, accuracy of responses, naturalness of responses, there's some way to go. But firms like Sol Machines are really improving this technology. And you can see these kinds of things in airports, for example, now as sort of digital wayfinders. But again, from the point of view of the shortage of talent in retailing, for example, providing service in stores as well as providing online avatars that represent the kind of branded service you could experience in stores, the scope for a generalized AI is really very, very powerful indeed, I think. Let me pause there and just check if there are any sort of questions or comments in there. Observations. Would you trust Viola?
Not now.
Not now. Well, that's the issue, isn't it? Yeah.
I just have a question. When you talk about AI and the experience of technology, how much do you believe that the human is important for in-store experience mostly, or not digital, but like in-store?
I think I would say still very important. I think that when you look at some behaviours, particularly amongst, let's say, young teenagers, you start to see that they don't see that as important, and indeed may actively want to avoid interaction with human beings in stores. They would far rather do everything asynchronously, on their phones, rather than deal with a real human being. And that's partly pandemic related, but it's also, I think, to do with the way in which some age groups are dealing with this. I think the human piece is important, but how it can be used. So for non-routine interventions. So routine interventions, fine. Where if you're in a home improvement retailer, ask the avatar where the hammers are. That's fine. But if you want some advice on what kind of hammer should I buy, then perhaps the human assistant is going to be far more able, at this stage at least, to help you in a way that is believable and trustworthy in a sense. Because you can tell whether they're trying to sell you the cheap one or not, or the expensive one. But I think that balance may change as these become more trusted and more kind of complex creations. If you can't trust the output, doesn't matter how convincing the simulation is, does it really? There's a challenge. But equally, I suppose you could argue you can't trust the human being that's in front of you, saying, "Madam looks perfectly superb in that dress," and actually it's like a sack of potatoes. You know, it's not suitable. So there are risks all around in that respect. Conscious of the time, I'll just finish off this final section of the challenge, which is the fourth challenge, which is around the political challenge. And I call it political because actually this does operate at the level of the nation state and at supranational level, at the European Commission level, for example. Because many of the businesses that are now into retailing, particularly online retailing, are larger than nation states. So the FANGs, the Facebooks or the Metas and the Amazons and the Netflixes and so on of this world are large operations. If you look at the worldwide top 10 platform companies, you know, sure, North America dominates with Microsoft, Apple and Amazon, Facebook, Meta and Alphabet. But actually, if you look at Asia Pacific now, we've got some very big challenges. Tencent, Alibaba, Samsung, ByteDance, and Didi and so on, which are actually, you know, probably far more innovative in some respects than the US ecosystem in this area. And what's really interesting about the growth of these is they're all getting into transactions. They're all getting into retailing, in effect. They want to become intermediaries. They want to become your intermediary of choice. So rather than shop from your DIY retailer, you buy the tool from Amazon because it's just easier. And Amazon is between you and the retailer. So they are disintermediating the retailer, the traditional retailer. The other issue is that states are becoming less and less able to regulate these kinds of entities. And so I think Zuckerberg's speechwriter is on record as saying, he used to say, you know, companies over countries, because he reckoned he was larger than most countries and could, you know, basically, there was I think an example in Australia where they lost in the end, but an issue about republishing news content, for example, on Facebook, against the wishes of the Australian government. So we have some real challenges here. You know, we have dominant platform intermediaries. We have non-state actors like Meta and Amazon becoming retailers, both in electronic and in physical form. We have, you know, retail collaboration with non-state actors and supplier collaboration. So Amazon becomes the new retailer of choice. And what's interesting, of course, is that we have JD.com and Alibaba in Asia, and we have Amazon in North America. There's a fight over Europe. There isn't a dominant platform provider in Europe. So who will win out? You know, until recently I would have said kind of China, but given the disaffection with Chinese inward investment recently at the highest levels, I suspect that the Chinese ambitions have been set back a bit, and Amazon may win the battle. But you know, there are major regulatory concerns. So we see, for example, Italy imposing a record fine on Amazon. We see big debates about online sales taxes on platforms and so on. And retailers, like it or not, are engaged and involved in those debates and have to deal with some of the consequences of the decisions made by these platform companies. Do we, you know, is it ignore, compete, or collaborate, basically, with these kinds of organizations? And regulators are not very helpful because there is nearly always a legislative lag between things that these very agile platform companies do and the way in which governments can respond by increasing regulation. So, for example, in the UK, we've had an Online Harms Act ready to go into Parliament for the last 3 years. And they're finally now getting around to actually regulating against online harms. You know, and yet, you know, people are being influenced and misled every day by the content on those platforms. So that level of challenge is a geopolitical challenge that retailers have to kind of engage in. There's also a challenge at the local level around sustainability and around improving places. So many of you will have come across the notion of the 15-minute city, for example, which is the idea developed by a French sociologist to develop what he called chrono-urbanism. So you would have everything that you needed, your workplace, your shopping, your leisure pursuits, close to home. This would be a more sustainable solution, environmentally livable solution. Everything within 15 minutes walk. This notion of hyper-proximity. And again, if you're a retailer, what does that mean? You know, so rather than building out-of-town shopping malls, you'd actually have essential living needs close at hand with convenience stores, smaller stores, artisanal retailers and so on. That regulatory change would have a fundamental influence on the nature of physical retailing in city centres. And lest we think this is imaginary, Paris has tried this. So Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, tried to unveil a 15-minute city plan as part of her re-election. She lost the election because actually in starting to do this kind of stuff, by getting rid of car parking spaces, putting in cycle lanes down the Champs-Élysées and this kind of thing, many residents said the city was dirty, was unkempt, was untidy, and she lost the election as a result of that. In Oxford, though, we're trying to do this. So we're actually breaking up the city into 15-minute chunks with barriers for cars. So you can't cross the city in a car from west to east anymore. And of course, as you might imagine, the retailers are desperately upset by this because they can't get access to those, to the centre of town, and it's very difficult for consumers to reach them. So, I think we're seeing some local regulatory responses to environmental concerns, which are leaving retailers with some hard choices to make about how they trade in local areas. And you see all kinds of responses. So if you combine that with the pandemic reactions, which is that people are staying more at home and shopping locally rather than going into large cities, what do you do if you're a retailer? So you see a variety of things. You see, this is a wine retailer in the UK called Majestic, which has developed local websites for each of its stores to provide locally customised wine offers. Pret-a-Manger is doing deals with petrol stations in local areas to have pop-up Pret-a-Manger takeaway outlets in those stores. Ted Baker, the fashion retailer, is planning temporary stores in commuter towns because it's losing money on its city centre stores. So it's creating all kinds of challenges for accommodating this lack of willingness that consumers have to return to the workplace. So finally, in the last 10 minutes, what should retailers plan to do with all these challenges? I've talked about the lessons from the pandemic. I've talked about the longer term challenges that retailers face. What's the short list of actions that retailers could take? Well, I always like to quote Jesper Brodin, who's CEO of Inca, and I'm sure well known to some of you, certainly to Ulf, because he has probably the most optimistic quote I've seen for some time. It's a brilliant quote. It's from a couple of years ago, and he was talking about the future of retailing. And he said, well, like most retailers, we don't know exactly where we will land at the end of it, but our curiosity and willingness to create will be a guide for us. Now that might be hyperbole, but it's a great quote because it suggests that retailers will always have the creative resources and the imagination to overcome these challenges. If you can only think creatively enough in ways that will produce a business model that is more viable for the new kinds of challenges that the sector faces. But let's think about some of the kind of the tangible aspects of this. I think first of all is resilience. So I talked about VUCA right at the beginning. So how do you develop resilience to the VUCA factors? Well, for volatility, how do you deal with stockpiling behaviour? Well, you stockpile yourself. You build in resource, you invest in talent and relate the cost to the risk. So how many times do you think there'll be a global pandemic? Well, hopefully not very often. So you may not have to lay in too many stocks of toilet roll, for example. What about complexity? Well, perhaps to deal with complexity, like the online example, you have to restructure the organisation to accommodate the online growth that's going to take place, but keep the flexibility and the balance between the two types of activity. Build in new skills, appropriate specialisms, and again, build up resources. Ambiguity, well, if you recall, that was the place problem. Where do we build our stores? Where do we find new demand? And the response there is to experiment more, to try out new ideas, to learn and apply lessons and be happy with failure because a lot of these will fail. So be content with failed experiments as well as successful ones. And uncertainty, the final one, it's around reducing uncertainty. So gaining more data insight, speaking to other people about who may have experienced that kind of uncertainty before. Get alternative viewpoints, build up different scenarios for how this might resolve itself. So there are strategic measures that firms can take to guard against or attempt to mitigate some of these pandemic type challenges. But you also need to think about your business model. And I'm going to use the Amazon one here to illustrate, because I think it's very clear what Amazon is doing. It's a very generic business model. What they're saying is, we want growth. How do we get growth? Okay, where do we start? Well, we start first of all by improving the customer experience by tackling the pain points in the current customer journey. As a result, we build traffic. As a result, we attract more brands onto our platform. As a result, we improve our selection and convenience to consumers, and that improves the customer experience. So it's a virtuous circle. To achieve the growth that we want, the increase in scale of our activities allows us a lower cost structure, which leads to lower prices, and in turn to an enhanced customer experience from the price point of view. So this wonderful virtuous circle, I think, is a great example of how Amazon is thinking around its, but it doesn't mention anything like books or TVs or health goods or whatever. You know, it can be done into anything in this respect. And if you look at Amazon's business model, then you see that their kind of profitability is a result of a number of activities, not just the first party platform piece, but it's based on Prime subscriptions, it's based on the third party platform, having other brands in the platform, third party services, advertising revenues, and supplying the technology platforms to other companies through Amazon Web Services. So they have a really resilient and sort of complex, but a model that trades off. So if one of these areas starts to lose money, others can offset that loss. So they can rebalance the model as they go along. And you can see this here. So I just pulled these stories from the last week. So the first story is saying Amazon makes a new push into healthcare. So we already knew this was happening, but Amazon is making a major play on providing over-the-counter medicines and healthcare services as a new growth market. At the same time, some of the technologies they've been trialing are failing, but they're willing to accept that failure. So in fact, they're going to lose $10 billion this year on Alexa, because no one uses Alexa other than to ask stupid questions like, where is Copenhagen, rather than please order me up some Carlsberg, what they discovered was we don't want to use, we don't trust using Amazon Alexa to buy groceries with, because we don't think it's good enough yet. So all they're doing is selling hardware for us to ask stupid questions about, when is Line of Duty on, or The Crown, or what's the weather like in Malmo. So a lot of money being lost there, and a lot of jobs being lost actually as well as a consequence of that. But they're willing to accept that ebb and flow in the model. Third one is collaborate. So I mentioned about Balenciaga. Here we have Balenciaga's tie-up with Crocs. If you've seen Crocs, anyone seen Crocs? Crocs. They're hideous things, but you can now get a high-heeled Croc. It's fantastic. You can also see with Primark, they've linked up with a down market fast food retailer called Greggs in the UK that sells disgusting things like sausage rolls and pasties and so on, which you only really want to eat when it's a cold morning and you've missed breakfast, because they're very bad for you. They sell these donuts with sprinkles on. And they put the Greggs store into Primark because the brands work well together. Likewise, the North Face and Gucci would like to reinforce each other's brands and are working closely together on that one. And the final example I wanted to talk about is an example of how a business has done nearly all of these things. It's collaborated, it's created defensible business models, it's built that resilience, and it's dealt with some of the uncertainty and volatility elements as well, and that's Next. It's a business worth looking at because actually it's probably one of our best performing UK fashion retailers ever, because it has managed successfully to anticipate and to develop its business model to cope with pretty well anything that's come its way, including the pandemic. So it lost a lot of money in 2020-21, but actually it's done pretty well, so longer term. So it started in 1981. It launched its mail order service before the internet was born in 1988, and it called itself One Brand and Two Ways of Shopping. It was a very high quality mail order catalogue. It went online as one of the earliest retailers in 1999, so it's then One Brand and Three Ways of Shopping. And it had, last year, nearly 500 stores, but it has been closing stores. So not only were stores locked down and closed, but it's made the decision to close certain stores. And we can see the impact here. So the revenues from stores are in blue, from online in red, and from their new financial services in grey. And you can see that the revenue from stores, fell off a cliff in 2020-21 because that was the pandemic year, recovered a little bit, but they were able to flex their supply into online in a very agile way. So they're very resilient. So you saw there was a dip there in revenues, but a return to pre-pandemic growth in 2022. And if you look at their profitability, you can see where the profit comes from. The profit has stopped coming almost from stores. Very small amount of profit contribution from stores. The bulk of it comes from online. The stores are acting as showrooms and galleries. People buy things from there, absolutely, but the margins are not as competitive as they are online, and that's where the profitability comes. And they've collaborated. So they've also, they launched a thing called the Total Platform, which is a bit like Amazon for clothing brands. And they've taken on board brands that went bankrupt, like Laura Ashley, Rice, Victoria's Secret, Gap, which closed all its European stores last year, has reopened on the Next platform. And they've been buying up brands like Jojo, Maman Bébé, the baby wear chain this year, and creating this total third-party platform, which again reinforces their strength in the online environment. And finally, they've even developed a department store. So they've gone fully back into stores, but in a very particular way. So this is the first of about 3 stores they've opened in the last year. It's the only department store openings in the UK in the last 3 years. Is their attempt to try and, again, a bit like Amazon, create a physical presence for the branded online offers that they have. And that's been enormously successful. So it's 6 o'clock, so I'm going to stop at this point. Thank you for your patience, as the room has got warmer, and your attention. What I've tried to do is paint you a picture, which I hope will help with your projects. Some of you will find bits more useful than others, but the pandemic lessons for retailing, spelling out those against the VUCA framework, the 4 longer-term challenges, and then some thoughts about what retailers should plan to do to accommodate those challenges. I'm happy to take any questions either now or immediately after, but it is 6 o'clock, so I'll stop here. Thank you.